From being blasted by Chael Sonnen for taking drugs to making absolutely ridiculous statements, Joe Rogan is facing the heat after comparing Jorge Masvidal to MMA legend Georges St. Pierre. Here's what the American gangster had to say about his comments. For starters, he thinks Joe's on drugs. When your job is to speak, it's pretty normal to say the wrong things. I mean, Rogan talks for hours at UFC events and during his podcasts. It's okay if his tongue slips and he says something that isn't true. But sometimes the UFC commentator tends to take things a bit too far. And that's exactly what happened while he was talking about now retired Jorge Masvidal. Now, before I continue, I want to get one thing out of the way. Gamebred is a great fighter. He has had some fantastic fights throughout his career, and I think fans will always remember him for that Ben Askren knockout. But was he really a better fighter than Georges St. Pierre? Well, Rogan thinks he was on an entirely different level. I'm not going to dive into the specifics and talk about their individual records because there's no need to do that. GSP is one of the greatest fighters of all time. When people talk about the GOATs, it's impossible to not include the Canadian on that list. He's had a heroic career, putting on some of the most brilliant performances fight fans have ever seen. And for Joe to categorize him lower than Masvidal is unbelievable. Like I said before, Jorge is a great fighter, but he doesn't even come close to St. Pierre. And when Chael first heard this statement, he was blown away. Without saying anything else, he immediately called out Rogan for being on drugs. And don't take things the wrong way. Sonnen thinks Joe is fantastic at his job, but it's best if fight fans dismiss his statement. It happens, people. We all know Joe is a really smart guy. He doesn't just know a lot about fighting, but if you've watched some of his podcasts, he's actually quite intellectual. He knows all sorts of things. And keeping all that in mind, Sonnen thinks people should dismiss what he said immediately. Who knows? Maybe he mixed things up and got a bit carried away. Or maybe he had a tough day at the office and said all that without putting much thought into it. But either way, Chael believes his statement has no importance at all, since it's the farthest thing away from the truth. In fact, there's no need to even compare their records because GSP is the better fighter by miles. Plus, Sonnen pretty much debunked Joe's statement with the simplest of logic. Joe wasn't trying to make a direct comparison. He was actually trying to say that the division is much more competitive today. And since it's more competitive, GSP would have much more difficulty rising to the top. I mean, alright, makes sense, but I'm going to side with Sonnen here. What in the world does competition have to do with Canadian? Sure, the game might be harder now than it was back then, but it still doesn't mean today's welterweights are better. Besides, Masvidal hasn't even been a champion. You can tell that statement really hit Sonnen hard. It actually feels like he found it a bit offensive, and I don't blame him. He's calling a guy who's never tasted UFC gold a better fighter than someone who's been a double champion. It makes zero sense at all. Believe it or not, Sonnen even challenged Joe to name one fighter GSP couldn't take down. And it left many people thinking about how he could fare against the likes of Kamaru Usman, a fighter who's run through the division 2 times. Well, even if you're a fan of the Nigerian and you understand the fight game, you know St. Pierre could take him down. I mean, I don't think there's one 170-pounder out there who could have beat the former UFC champion in his prime. And it'd make a lot of sense if Joe backed what he was saying with facts or something, you know. Or if not that, at least talk about their fighting styles, right? Just because today's fighters face more competition, they're all better than the old schools? That's literally what he said. And honestly speaking, Joe's made some controversial statements, but this has to be the most ridiculous ever. Sonnen, on the other hand, thinks it's the stupidest. If Masvidal was around back then, he'd be dangerous for everyone. Honestly, that's an okay statement to make. He was a dangerous fighter during his prime. But saying that he's on another level than everyone else is a bit of an overstatement. Because look at it this way. What level is Joe talking about here? He couldn't even beat today's competition. How would he possibly have beaten fighters back then? And this goes without saying. Masvidal certainly made his mark on the promotion, along with the fastest knockout in UFC history. He had some really impressive victories over Jake Ellenberger and Donald Cerrone. But then again, he also lost 2 consecutive matches against Stephen Thompson and Damian Maia. Plus, if I were to break down Chael's argument, it's actually quite simple. The level of competition has absolutely no relation with GSP's ability as a mixed martial artist. And let's assume for a second it does. Then what about today's landscape? Why isn't Masvidal being compared to the level of competition? He's an average fighter compared to the likes of Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, and Khamzat Chimaev. Like he'd get mauled if he ever had to take on the Chechen Wolf. So yeah, as much as I admire Jorge's exceptional trash-talking skills, his mentality, and his skill as a fighter, there's no way he's on a different level to St. Pierre. And to be honest, I think everyone saw that in the fight against Burns. It was a well-fought battle, especially when you consider how Masvidal is well past his prime. He's what, 38 years old now? And the fact that he was able to give Burns such a tough challenge is incredible. But at the end of the day, it was the right time to hang up the gloves because he wasn't going to get any better. There's no way he could have competed with younger and ambitious fighters. So yeah, in his own regard, he's done enough. MMA fans are lucky to have seen Masvidal compete at the UFC. But talks of him being greater than GSP just don't resonate with Sonnen and the fans. Let's see though. I don't think Rogan will try to hit back at Chael because there's not much he can say. He can't argue with facts or records. He can't talk much about Jorge's achievements in light of GSP's. Because, well, St. Pierre has always been on a different level. Plus, Rogan's opinion is flawed. Do you know when Jorge made his debut at the promotion? Prepare to be blown away. Gamebred was an active fighter just 1 year after GSP joined the UFC. So technically speaking, he fought in the same era as him. There's no way he faced better competition because they were on the same roster. They both fought in similar circumstances. Sure, they didn't fight each other, but even if they did, I think fans know how it would have played out. And the fact that GSP was able to extend his dominance in that era, at the same time Jorge was competing, is reason enough to prove who was performing at a higher level. So, sorry Joe, everyone makes mistakes, but it's rare to see someone discrediting one of the greatest fighters of all time. So, from presenting flawed opinions to being called a druggie, that's everything Sonnen had to say about Rogan's claims.